No apologies, thank you, Chair.
Chair, Councillor Matthew Holmes will be with us shortly.
Chair, Councillor Tim Prosser, apologies.
Sorry, so the recommendations are to approve the proposal set out in Appendix 1 to progress the Executive Scrutiny Board 2021-22 Performance Plan, which was approved in August 2021, subject to the approval of Recommendation 2.1 to recommend that the performance items identified at Appendix 1 are referred to include on the work programme with the relevant overview and scrutiny review boards for 2021-22, and to note the draft overview and scrutiny review boards work plans for 2021 and 2022.
Okay, if I can ask you, the acoustics are very poor in here. I understand that we are going to improve these over the coming months, so if you can get quite close to the mic, please, and speak up. I can see people straining, but okay. Lucy.
Thank you. I was wanting to raise one of those items that's referred to in recommendation 2.2 regarding referral to a different overview and scrutiny. And that is the one related to climate change. Because the recommendation here is to refer that to regen and housing. But I think that's too narrow a view as to look at climate change for the whole city. So it either needs to go to each scrutiny board because there are implications for education, for transport, for community, whatever area it is, there are implications both in terms of actions we should be taking and also risks related to climate change. So it either needs to stay here, Chair, in my view, so that members here who take a wider view and bring in expertise from all those areas look at it, or else it needs to go to each of the overview and scrutiny commissions for each to consider.
I think what we're attempting to do, Lucy, and I'm sure members would support, is trying to give the work programmes the opportunity for councillors in those individual work programmes to look at these in some detail. You make a reasonable point with regard to this particular item, and I think that's one that could go into all the agendas of the various scrutiny boards for them to feed into it. Remember, it does come back here at the end of the day where we can add to it, subtract to it and make comment on it. But I think the initial examination ought to be done by those individual scrutiny boards. So I'm quite happy for that particular item to go to the individual ones. Okay. Yep, we'll take that on board.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are there any more comments about this particular? You've got the recommendations here, 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. Are you happy with those recommendations? Is any,
as amended, Chair.
As amended, of course. Okay. No dissent. Various people are nodding. Thank you very much for that. Okay. Right, moving on to the Council Cabinet Agenda, item 8. Approval of the Council Tax Support Scheme for 2022-23. Who's taking us through this? Is it you, Simon? Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. This is an annual report we have to seek the approval of Cabinet for. The recommendation is that the scheme remains unchanged from what was operable in 2021-22. Just to highlight that the scheme applies to people of working age, not pensioners, and that's quite important. The appendix details the minimum contribution that people have to make of those people of working age, which is 30%, but then there are a series of criteria detailed in the policy which apply in sort of calculating that amount. So happy to take any question, Chair, but fundamentally an unchanged scheme from 21-22 to operate for the next financial year.
Thank you, Simon. Lucy.
Chair, it's only an administrative point in that within this it talks about the appeals process as being required to write to the address of the Council House. It doesn't give an alternative to have an email address to send in an appeal to. And I think in this day and age, we should be accepting emails as appeals and not just pieces of paper. Is that something that we would be able to amend without going out to further consultation?
I'll ask Simon that very question. Simon.
Absolutely. It's about us receiving the communication which allows this to progress in line with the spirit of the appeals process. So I'm happy to add that in to the version which we adopt for next year.
Thank you, Simon. Lucy, you want to come back again?
Yeah, I just wondered, Chair, in the light of that report, whether we should put in a recommendation to that effect to Cabinet, or whether it can be picked up formally in some other way.
I suspect it can be picked up, but Simon, what do you think?
I will just make that amendment because it is about communicating with the Council in the most appropriate way. So I don't think we need a recommendation, Councillor Kerr.
I'm quite happy with that. Are you, Lucy? Okay. Thanks very much, Simon. Moving on to item 9. This is the Strategic Director for Communities and Place. Okay. Who's...
Is that the local plan? Is that me?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
I look in the wrong direction. It's like being at an auction. When you move slightly, you've bought it. Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. This report seeks approval to start a new local plan process. The national planning policy requires us to review our local plan every 5 years, which we have done using the Planning Advisory Service Toolkit, and the details of which of that assessment are attached in the appendix in more detail. But the review of our policies indicate that the policy that we have around meeting our housing requirements are no longer consistent with national policy. And the key reason for that change is the change in the assessment of our housing needs target. So government has changed its standard methodology for calculating our housing requirement figures, and on top of that has included a 35% uplift for the top 20 urban areas, of which Derby is one. So what we are looking at now, the current plan would suggest that we need about just over 600 houses every year to meet our target. With the uplift, that figure goes up to over 1,000 a year. So it is very significant. Hence, we feel this triggers the need for a new local plan. One thing that's worth mentioning because of that lack of consistency now is that it's very unlikely come January that we'll be able to say that we've got that 5-year housing supply. So it means we'll have to operate our planning decisions with a tilted balance, so that's towards in favour of development. So you know we're a compact city and that we have few options for development sites within the city, which means that we will have to work with our neighbouring authorities to help us meet those housing targets. And we do that already, and we have governance in place to do that. We work cooperatively with them. So, and we know that the South Derbyshire District Council and Amber Valley have already started new local plans. And therefore, it's really, really important that we work in alignment and we get agreement to reduce all of our exposure. And the best thing is to do that together and start the local plan process in parallel. So, what do we want to do? We want the new plan to look out towards 2040. We want it to include important areas of development such as climate change, the new city centre plan, we look at new design codes, etc. We want to work collaboratively with our neighbours, as I've said, to make the most efficient use of the studies that we will have and the resources that we have collectively to make this right. One of the most important things in there as well is that we will be asking Cabinet to ask yourselves to set up a local plan member working group. I think for me this is one of the most important documents that the Council creates, and it's really important that we get cross-party engagement. So it would be a task and finish group of the exec scrutiny if that is approved, and then obviously we'd be coming to talk to yourselves around terms of reference and for your endorsement of that. The timescales are set out in the plan, they're indicative at this stage, and as you all probably all very aware, it's a heavily regulated process that will require formal examination by the planning inspectorate in the end, but we're hoping that for adoption around the end of 2024. So just the last thing to say is that through our housing market area, which is the way we manage jointly, we have had a thorough consideration of creating a joint plan that was fully discussed, but it was concluded that separate but aligned plans was the most appropriate way forward. And finally, just to say that I appreciate that we've probably been thinking about this for a little while, and one of the things that's caused us to hold ourselves back is the new planning bill. We know that this has been paused nationally, and the benefit of moving now with this new plan is that we can look at some policies where there has been significant movement since the current adopted plan, such as climate change, biodiversity, etc. We will of course mitigate any risk on anything that might be abortive, but I must stress that the recommendation from national government is that local government press on with local plans and get things moving. So that's everything, Chair. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if it's going to be possible, but the concerns have been raised, certainly by members of my own group, with Paul Clark and others about HIMOs being set up in areas that are not really conducive to the people living in them and the people being moved into these areas. It seems to be a bit of a developer's charter. Can we use this new local plan in any way to try to control that?
I think yes. I mean, in a sense, we are starting out with a new local plan. Some of the things that have become much more of an issue along the way are things that we can look at. And certainly with yourselves, you know, as I said, the importance for me is that we get that cross-party working, that you are there to advise and guide and influence as we move along. So certainly, you know, I know that you've been talking to the Chief Planning Officer and that you're looking at ways to do that. You obviously those things are not without complexity, but that's certainly something that I think we can take a view on through this local plan process.
Yes, before I bring Hardiel in, we understand the complexities. We understand, I think somebody said that Nottingham has 10 times more enforcement officers than we do. Well, they don't charge 10 times more the council tax that we have, so it's trying to understand about where our priorities are, and it may be that we have to give extra priority for this particular area. So I'm glad that we can possibly take that on board and look at that, because it does need looking at. That's not to deny the opportunity for individual properties, but there's plenty of them, single-person properties springing up, thousands of them. So in terms of supply and demand, you'd think they'll be at a reasonable price. I'll bring in Hardiel now. Hardiel.
Thank you, Chair. The officer mentioned already that the city is limited by its geography, and that does put us under a disadvantage, and we know that our local authorities surrounding us are not going to be cooperative, but I think the plan still needs to relook at, should I say, how we can actually increase our space so that we get housing built within the city boundary, because that means council tax for us rather than other authorities building on the periphery of the city with the infrastructure use that we have to bear without the benefit of the council tax returns. So will this local plan review the potential of how we can actually try to get more land space so that we can accommodate the people of Derbyshire who live in the city of Derby within the city boundaries, as opposed to having to go outside into other local authorities? And how do the officers think they could do this, relook at this, and with new vigour and new ideas and imagination?
it might require a boundary review and boundary extensions, but over to Verna now.
Yes, I'm afraid that local government reorganisation doesn't come within the bounds of a new local plan, I'm afraid. So I'm sorry that isn't something that I think we can be achieved through this. What I would hope to achieve is that closer joint working, that we work through with our HMA partners, that we align our plans, we work under that duty to cooperate and manage that sensibly together, including how we look at the infrastructure that supports any new development.
Thank you.
Thank you. As we are discussing, I mean, I think this report is just to launch the plan, isn't it? But as people are raising some of the key issues, obviously, I would just like to mention the issue of transport, which is transport connectivity, which is often the reason why residents often object to new housing developments is, in my experience of being on the planning committee, was most of the time it's because of the impact of more cars, as much as it is any objection to new houses and accommodation as such. So obviously, I'm sure you're aware of this, but any plan must prioritise transport links and public transport links. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Rachel.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to sort of respond to the question around the boundary and the local government reorganisation sort of conversation. As Werner has said, that can't be dealt with in this process. But in terms of looking at our own land within the city boundary and where housing may be appropriate to be developed, that will be a priority of the local plan list review. It's a government intention to obviously to promote brownfield land and to use things that are existing uses and that sort of thing as well, and we will do that. And also as part of the recognition of the need for change and need to review is because of climate change expectations at a national and a local level of change in the last 5 years that will be taken into account absolutely in the local plan work.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, Lucy.
Thank you. And I wanted to raise two things as well. One is just a question about when we're going to have the 2021 census information, because I feel this is something that should be feeding into our review of the local plan. We know that alongside COVID, there have been significant changes, particularly as related to Brexit and people's employment. Working from home has brought changes in as well, and I think we need to have that census information to know more clearly about what the function of the city is and what its population and housing demand and those sorts of things as well. And I think we need to make best use of that as soon as we can. And we're getting to the end of the year and we all filled it in electronically, or I don't know, 90% of people did. So it should be, that data I should think should be here sooner. And alongside that, the Appendix 1 has, among the matters to consider, which were being looked at, it includes A5, which has been said that we actually agree that we're okay on this one. But looking at the commercial floor space and jobs targets, and I want to emphasise that it isn't just the space that is important, but it's also the location of that space, because we want to minimise the need for people to travel, so that we don't have the issues of constant more and more traffic. So if we don't get the employment in the right areas, we've got an issue. And I think that needs to be brought very much into our thinking. And secondly, because of the population changes, I think we're less looking at a desperate need for more jobs as an increase in skills to fill jobs that are vacant. I think we've got one of the highest levels of employment at the moment across the country, and we need to make best use of those who are not in employment rather than necessarily seeking more and more jobs for the area. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody want to come back on that?
I honestly, don't know when the census information will come back. I don't know if any other colleagues do. But I'm sure that if we get it in a timely fashion, then obviously it should inform the local plan. And I think for me, all of the points that have been made tonight make it well exciting, because I'm excited that you are very keen on the local plan and your commitment and wanting to get involved. And we are, as Councillor Martin said, this is the start of the process. I think with your support in that cross-party working group, then all of these issues we can debate and discuss and make this a great plan that's owned by all of us.
Thank you very much for that. Okay. Right, moving on to item 10, vision and strategy for Derby's built indoor leisure facility provision. Is this going to be... Do you want to introduce yourself to those that don't know you?
Yes, good evening, Chair. I'm Wayne Sills. I'm Area Leisure Centre Manager, working in leisure, culture and tourism.
Thanks. Cheers. Thank you.
Welcome.
Cheers.
1 second, sorry. So the purpose of the report is to provide you with an overview of our vision and strategy for Derby's built leisure facilities. The built leisure facilities are our swimming pools, sports halls, health and fitness provision. The leisure strategy forms part of our evidence base for sport and physical activity across the city. And in terms of the report that is going to Cabinet tomorrow, we'll be asking to approve a number of recommendations. The first one is to adopt the built leisure facility strategy that is appended to the report, and that covers the period up to 2028, and that ties in with the current housing plans. We'd also be looking to ask for approval to carry out a strategic review of swimming provision in 3 years' time to assess the impact of the new Moorway Sports Village opening, and also to take on board any of the city's recovery and growth from the COVID pandemic. Subject to approval, we'd also be looking to establish an action plan which would cover the period of the report to ensure that the strategy's key objectives are delivered in an appropriate time frame. And the strategy would also be used to inform the development and review of our local planning development documents, as well as support any external funding bids that we may be looking to put in for our built leisure facilities. It also supports our planning colleagues in terms of discussions that they have with developers around Section 106 funding, for example. And it also would help inform any future decisions around the built leisure facilities within the city over the coming years. The reason for the new strategy is the current one was completed in 2009 and was adopted in 2010. And since then, there's been a number of significant changes to the built leisure provision within the city, namely the closure of Moorway Sports Centre, swimming pool, and the opening of Derby Arena in 2015. We appointed FMG Consulting to undertake an audit of our sports facilities in the city and to update the current leisure facilities to cover the period 2018 to 2028. But earlier this year, a further refresh of our sports hall and swimming pool provision was undertaken, and Sport England was commissioned to undertake their facility planning model. The planning model looks at the total supply provision within the city for swimming and sports halls. It also looks at the demand and how much of that demand within the city is met by the population. It also looks at the impact of changes in supply of provision in terms of neighbouring authorities, and it also takes account of any population changes and housing growth over the given period. In terms of the sports halls and swimming pool provision, just to give you an overview of the outcome of that assessment is, for sports halls, we looked at two runs in terms of provision. The first one was to assess our current demand and supply, and the second one was to then look at any changes between now and 2028 and how that would affect supply and demand for sports halls. Based on the facility planning model assessment, it's pleasing to note that the quality and provision of sports halls within the city is very good, and the demand for our sports halls can be met by the current and proposed supply of sports halls up to 2028. However, it did highlight that the majority of our sports halls are owned by educational establishments, and any reduction in community use at those facilities would have a significant impact on the overall supply and demand balance that exists. So one of the key actions for us as a service is how we work with our educational providers to ensure that we maintain as much community access as possible. In terms of the swimming pool provision, we carried out 3 assessment runs. The first one, again, looking at our current provision and supply. The second one was to keep the status quo, but add in Moorway Sports Village opening in 2022 and look at how that impacted on the provision and the demand. And then the third one was to take the current supply, include Moorways, but exclude Queen's Leisure Centre and Lonsdale Swimming Pool. And based on the assessment, it's been to note that the final test run of Moorways Open and the exclusion of Queen's and Lonsdale would meet the demand for swimming within the city. The location and scale of Moorways, and the reason for that is the location and scale of the Moorway Sports Village with its extensive swimming offer can meet that projected demand for Derby residents. However, it is keen to know that Moorways would be fairly full in the peak period if both facilities were to close. And whilst Moorways does improve accessibility for residents in the south, there could be some impacts on residents who live close to Queen's and Lonsdale if those pools were to close. As well as looking at sports halls and swimming pools, the LFS also looks at health and fitness, community centre provision, athletics and tennis. Following the adoption of the strategy and the development of the action plan, we then meet with relevant stakeholders as part of the delivery of the strategy. Thank you.
I'm going to ask members if they can save the aspects and comments on Queen's, because we're going to have a major item very shortly on the proposed closure of the Queen's Leisure Centre, and there'll be associated things with that members wish to actually raise. So I'm going to ask them to save those particular comments for that particular paper. But so in terms of the overall vision and strategy, I'll invite members to speak. Alison.
Thank you, Chair. I think that you obviously have considered this a lot, far more than I have. But just to agree that you do need to keep in mind school provision. If you're relying on school sports facilities being open to the community, because as you know, the vast majority of our secondary schools, where most of these sports facilities are now run by academy trusts, property under lease. So, but even before then, obviously schools have some kind of right to determine who uses their facilities. And I'm not talking about Queen's principally here, Martin, but just to touch on although I will want to say something on that later on, but with respect to, say, swimming pools, I know in the 2010 strategy, which is obviously a very historic document now, I do acknowledge, but the Woodlands School Pool was one of the satellite pools identified, I believe, in that document for use by the community. And for reasons, basically Woodlands no longer make that swimming pool accessible to the local community. They closed down all public swimming. No doubt for good reasons as far as the school is concerned, but absolutely, I think relying on school facilities, much as I believe there should be community schools with facilities open to the community, it is a potential weakness in the current environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. It's some good points. I don't know if you want to come back on that, the weakness in relying on facilities that we can't control. And I think a good example there was Woodlands, which decided to say, no, we're not going to open it to the public, because they have the power to do that.
Sorry, Chair. In terms of sports hall provision, I would agree, because the current assessment is the majority of our sports halls are provided by educational establishments, and I think the key thing for us is to how we can work with them to ensure that they do continue to provide community access, and it's just trying to work with them, understand where they're coming from and how they can engage with their local community. So I think it is a critical area around sports hall provision, because that is they are the dominant supplier within the city.
Hardiel.
I just want to come back on the same point. I think the officers tried to answer the question. We are reliant on, and this is not new, schools having facilities that could be used by the public has always been something that has had a focus. And this strategy should really look at how do we maximise that and how do we get accessibility, because schools, one, aren't open all the time, even term time, and there are times off when they're on holidays, those facilities stay idle. And we've got to maximise use of those. So we need to be looking at ways of how we can access those. And if we can't, we should be looking to see how we make more publicly available facilities. I mean, if you, in looking at the report, under athletics, for example, we don't have an indoor athletics facility, and the report recommends that that would be beneficial. And how do we begin to do that? So we do need to look at a comprehensive. The strategy actually is identifying a lot of things. Same with the tennis centre facilities. They're both not fit for purpose. And how is this strategy going to look to develop our facilities so that we make publicly accessible facilities that can enable people in Derby to actually maximise their potential to become future tennis stars, athletes, even, may I say, footballers, because we need them pretty badly in Derby at the moment.
Good points. Wayne, how do we try to ensure we get that? Rachel, do you want to come in instead of Wayne? Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, it's a really important point, and I think I want just to make the overarching point that this is a strategy for all provision in the city, so private and public provision. So some of that provision, Hardle, is obviously managed by the private sector, and they meet some of those needs, and it isn't always up to the council to do that. But the central point about access to a sports hall provision in our educational establishments is why it's so critical. We work really, really closely with our multi-academy trusts and build really strong relationships with them that understand the value of their facilities for those communities, and they maintain their interest in doing so. We have little power over them, as been said, but we can work in a really partnership way to try and use our influence, and we need to do that and do that more we possibly can. So it isn't a straightforward, this is the gaps in provision, council go and meet all those gaps. It is looking at the whole of the sector that might meet some of that private and public sector and trying to use all the tools we've possibly got, some of it direct provision and some of it influence, to try and achieve that capacity. Thank you.
Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to talk about the other end of the activity spectrum and the majority of people in Derby who are not taking as much exercise as we would like them to have. And the reports highlight this in terms of the different categories of people who are exercising at a low level or at an elite level. But the report itself is much more angled towards those who are already engaged in the various sporting activities that we're talking about provision for. Now, if we are going to make sure that this strategy is actually holistic against all our other council aims to do on the health and well-being side and the Move More philosophy, we need to make sure that we're actually supporting the venues which people will be eased into doing more activity, and not just those where people are able to do indoor tennis or fitness regimes and things. And I think we need to therefore be looking really carefully at our community centres and the support we give to them, the encouragement we give to other activities than the specific fitness activities, so the dance side of things and the more gentle activities that can ease people in onto a fitness level. And I can't see how that is being included within this strategy, and I hope it is there somewhere. Because if we're going to change around the inequalities in our society, we need to be able to do that in a way that doesn't require you to do a more people will have to go outside their comfort zone to be able to step into an exercise venue if they're not already exercising. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing are people who are going out and starting jogging. And I think people who've done that during lockdown is the tip of the iceberg. If we have the right opportunities that people can access. And some of this is leadership. So in terms of a strategy, we need to also look at the skills and the encouragement that we're getting people who can be trained up to do those activities, whether it's with older people in care homes or young women who have left school or whatever the groups are that we need to target. So how are we doing that, and how does that fit with this indoor strategy?
Sure, we'll have an answer from Rachel.
Well, so that, yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I think the point, however, is that this is a particular piece of work that informs under our local plan the need and the supply and demand issues around particular things, in this case, built indoor facilities. We also have as a council our Move More strategy, which is absolutely targeted at all the things Councillor Kerr has just mentioned. And I would say absolutely concur with that analysis. We need to work with everything we can to get people to move and be physically active, and often it's the end of the line of that activity to actually go into an indoor facility and do a particular organised event. It is about the softer stuff, the working in parks, working with our libraries to do things in the care homes and being much, much more focused on what are the barriers to activity. So Move More is our strategy for that, and very much is part of the suite of these things that come together.
Alison.
Yeah, just to add the point that obviously the council's reach, as you say, Rachel, goes well beyond this in the sense that we have all the community centres that are largely, well, they're all council owned, not always council run, but and so much activity actually takes place in those sorts of halls, whether it's Zumba, yoga, dance, and so the reach of the council, and they're very cheap because often renting the hall is quite cheap. So actually, and often that's the best way of spreading activity into the community. It's not actually via a gym or a sports hall. It's the community hall which the council does actually provide. So I'm sure that Claire's very well of this, but I mean, it is worth making that point and taking that into account when you're considering what activities are encouraged by the council. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Yep, it's some very good points which I think have been taken on board. Alan, and yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to say that I thought the overall vision and strategy was eloquently presented, and I'm very happy with what I've heard tonight. And I also think we should congratulate Leisure and Culture, the department that works in this area. And when we talk about Woodland School, it may be that they've pulled back on the sharing of the swimming, probably due to COVID. I mean, that could well be a reason. And I'd also like to, so we have a very good tennis club in Alistry, which Councillor Martin is probably not a member, but neither am I. But also think about the Derby Walking Festival. I mean, Derby City Council has a walking festival, and I know that was very active this year and brought in a lot of partners. And I think that's something that's moving forward, Chair.
Okay. Some good points. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really excited certainly by the Moorways swimming complex being open soon. I can't wait to use all the facilities that are going to be on offer. I'm looking forward to all the slides. Big kid at heart, I'd love to go down and have a go on the wild ball and all that kind of stuff. But there's the one thing that I'd like to raise is that many residents who I speak to discuss that it's difficult if you don't have a motor vehicle to get to Moorways from particularly the north of the city. On page 5 at point 422, it discusses a partner operator for the Moorway Sports Village will be asked to work with public transport providers to promote active travel routes. Can I have the officer's view on what would that would look like, particularly the partner the partner operator working with public transport provider. What would that look like? People have discussed with me an omnibus type service around the city, and also as well, you know, reading the wording, it does sound a little bit weak. In the wording, I'd like to see something a little bit stronger that this will happen, because we need to make sure that people can get to the amazing Moorways Sports Village from all over the city, not just in the local area.
Let's hope it's a bit more reliable than the 17A, which was withdrawn and left people stranded. Right, Wayne.
Thank you, Chair. Just in response to Councillor Cooper's comments, we've already had conversations with colleagues in our passenger transport service, and they are currently reaching out to the transport providers. We're looking at setting up a meeting with them ourselves early in the new year to talk about improved bus routes and access to Moorways, and how we can work together in order to try and respond to those concerns. In terms of the other areas around active travel, in terms of walking, cycling and running, is then again looking, when the new partner operator is on board, is looking at how we can promote and publicise those routes to Moorways, because there are a number of good cycle routes around the city, and it's trying to encourage those families not just to rely on their car, but actually in terms of using cycle routes and things like that. We've got 40 cycle spaces at Moorways, which is probably more than a lot of other facilities have, and certainly more than we've got at Queen's and other venues. And again, it's just looking at how we can work with the provider to promote those and link that into their programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I've got Hardiel and then Alison. Hardiel.
Thanks. I think Councillor Cooper makes a really good point. I mean, accessibility, it is a great facility. It will be a great facility when it's open in more ways, but it is on one end of the city, and it is. I share the concern about people, how they're going to get there. I mean, the answer of talking to the transport providers, I would suggest that the potential of that is high, but the reality will be low, because as we've learned, when we try to negotiate with transport providers about routes which are not commercially advantageous to them, you have to find subsidy. Without the subsidy, they will not do that, and we have not been able to do that on other, as Councillor Repton just mentioned. We all know in our local communities when we wanted routes to be sustained, and they weren't sustained because we don't have the subsidy and they don't have the commercial inclination to do it. So I think officers engaging in discussion is really good, but I dare say that we will not be that successful. I hope I'm proven wrong, unless we put subsidy and levies into that. And that also means that we should be trying to make sure we do develop our community centre facilities and others for indoor activities. And we need to have within this, there should be a strategy of how the facilities we have all across the city, which community centres, how we encourage and invest in more activities, indoor activities happening in those centres, as well as pushing the schools as far as we can in terms of using their facilities.
I forgot Mike earlier, sorry. Mike, then Alison, and then Mike.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I was going to save my remarks on this particular subject to the next item, but being as Councillor Cooper and Councillor Dinsner have raised it, I think the paragraph about asking, I agree with what Councillor Dinsner is saying, is far too passive in my view. We should be, perhaps we're moving towards a recommendation here, but the way we engage public transport to get transport to Moorways, I think will need stronger than we're just going to ask a few public transport providers. And I don't quite know how to frame that, but I agree with everything Councillor Dinsner said about maybe it needs subsidies, but I think just asking public transport providers is not good enough from my view.
I suspect, unless you pay them because they're a commercial company, they aren't going to offer it for free. I mean, yes, I'm sure we'd all love them to do, but they're just not going to do it. Alison.
Thank you, Chair. I know I've already spoken, so I'll be very brief. I entirely agree with Councillor Dinser and Councillor Carr. You know, the reality of bus services and public transport in the city, when there's a strong case for more direct buses to the railway station, for example, to improve an integrated transport system, which arguably are just as strong as taking people to the swimming pool. So there's lots of need for buses that don't go into the bus station and out again. So you're on 2 buses, which is hassly. You know, you're not going to do that if you've got 3 small kids with wet hair. It's just the reality. So I agree with those councillors strongly. Just very, very quickly to respond to Councillor Grimmadale, the reason I stress the Woodlands case is not... the reason they know that you can't just go there and swim anymore is not because of COVID, it's because, and it's legitimate as far as the school's concerned, they need to maximise income and they can gain more by offering it, blocking it out for classes. So in that sense, there are people going there to learn to swim that are members of the public, but as a sort of casual adult just wanting a swim, you can't go there anymore. And the risks of the city in terms of the sports halls is that if you start getting a system where, as you know, I'm sure you thought about this, but where all the clubs suddenly want to book up the halls, which is great because it is members of the public, but that just means the person who wants to casually, that those casual people who do sport casually are pushed out even further. So that was just the risk I was indicating. And I didn't hear what you said was coming to Alistry, but I'm sure if it's a new gym, I'm not going to join it. Thank you, Alan. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. Right. I'll take you, Lucy, and then we will move on to item 11. Okay, Lucy.
Thank you. I just following up the transport theme. I think we need to look not just at the moorways as a location, but we need to look at other places around the city. The railway station was mentioned, but which are off-centre and difficult to get to without making double journeys. The other one being, the major one being the Royal Derby Hospital, but there are also major employers such as Rolls-Royce, which at certain times of day are also venues that there ought to be people who would choose to travel by bus. So we need to have a holistic look at the bus services, not just thinking that we've got one to look at. The other thing I wanted to draw to attention on the similar theme is paragraph 428, which is the point about saying that we want to review how swimming has changed and how successful the move has been in 3 years' time. Now, one of the comments there is that we need to talk to residents who currently use Queen's Leisure Centre and Lonsdale Swimming Pool. Now, I know people who currently walk to Lonsdale, and their alternative is not going to be going to Moorways, it's going to be going to Etwall, because Etwall is more direct, it's going to add to the travel, and where Lonsdale find their alternative site, which I know they're continuing to look at, it may not be of Blagrees Lane, it might be somewhere else, but even so, it's likely to be further for the people who are currently walking. And I think that we need to know how we're going to talk to those current users in 3 years' time. How do we identify that cohort of people now so that we can go back to them in 3 years and say, are you still swimming? Are you not? Why not? And it makes it impossible to identify the people who would have started swimming because maybe they're retiring or they've had a health problem and they're being advised to do swimming at some point in the next 3 years and who can't get to Moorways. So I think it's a really difficult piece of work that we've got to do, but we need to prepare for it before Queen's closes.
Thank you, Alison. Okay, we'll note that report. Thank you very much, and we'll move on to now item 11. Who's going to take us through? Is this you, Wayne, or... Yep, Wayne. It's down to you.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair. The purpose of this report is to provide the information to determine the future of Queen's Leisure Centre. And it's noted that 2 previous Cabinet reports, one in November 17 and one in February 19, both detailed the expectation that Queen's Leisure Centre would close when Moorway Sports Village opened. In terms of the recommendations that we're asking Cabinet to consider, the first one is to consider the outcome of the public consultation, which collates all the information from the public consultation that took place between 22nd of July and the 14th of October this year. We're also asking him to note and consider the strategic need assessment for the provision of swimming within the city that we've just spoke about. The information collated by FMG Consultancy, which is detailed in the report, and the equality impact assessment, which was appended to the main cabinet report. We're also being asked to approve the cessation of the current leisure operation at Queen's Leisure Centre and delegate to the Strategic Director of Communities in Place all necessary actions linked to that decision, and also to delegate approval to the Strategic Director for Communities in Place in consultation with our Cabinet Member for Wellbeing, Leisure, Culture and Tourism to agree the exact closure date aligned to the opening date of Moorways Sports Village and any activities required to transfer the two. The reasons for the recommendations are, as previously discussed, the strategic assessment for provision of swimming pools carried out earlier this year concluded that the location and scale of Moorways Sports Village, with its extensive swimming offer, can meet the projected demand for swimming by Derby residents without the current services being delivered at Queen's. Also to note that the equality impact assessment demonstrated that the new provision at Moorways, with its extensive swimming, health and fitness, sport and physical activity offer, ensures positive impacts for residents across the city. However, the IA did note and identify the potential negative impact for those customers who access Queen's either via public transport or walking. And as earlier mentioned, we're looking to address that by talking and working with our colleagues in passenger transport and the local transport providers, as well as working with the new operator at Moorways in terms of promoting active travel opportunities. As part of the work undertaken by FMG regarding the leisure facility strategy, they undertook a benchmarking and quality audit exercise of all our leisure facilities, including Queen's, and the overall information demonstrates significant underperformance of Queen's against a number of key leisure metrics. The information for Queen's was updated to 2019-2020, was its last full year of operation pre the pandemic. In terms of the benchmarking, swimming income is at the lower end of the benchmark, as was health and fitness, with a number of members per station being around circa 7, which is significantly below the benchmark of 20 to 25 members. It's also noted that staff costs as a percentage of income is also very high. In addition to the benchmarking, FMG also undertook a quality audit. Queen's did score well in certain areas such as disabled access and changing. However, it scored low in general changing areas, and the outcome of the audit was that Queen's required significant investment in its changing facilities, but that also needed to take into account the context of age and design of the facility. As well as the FMG data, there's also been a 40% decline in attendances at Queen's over the last few years. The impact of COVID and the closure of the teaching pool and gym have reduced attendances at the centre over the period from just over 218,000 to a forecasted 130,000 for this year. The age and design of Queen's is not suitable for modern leisure use and as such delivers poor quality service to its customers. As mentioned earlier, the overall underperformance of the facility is potentially likely to worsen with opening of Moorways early next year. There are current closures within the centre, so the teaching pool changing rooms and the gym are currently closed due to ongoing maintenance and health and safety issues. Any future investment would not represent good value for money. If Queen's was to remain to be retained, major capital investment to make it fit for purpose as a modern day facility would be required. A condition survey undertaken in 2018 identified a high level budget cost for life cycle replacements be in the region of 8 million, with significant investment in replacing roof coverings and electrical and mechanical services. Since then, further deterioration has taken place, and as mentioned earlier, areas are now closed. Between April 19 and March 2022, Queen's would demonstrate a significant subsidy to the council, with an estimated revenue cost being a leisure subsidy of approximately 1.9 to 2 million, and with estimated property costs being between 525,000 to 725,000. In terms of the public consultation that was carried out earlier this year, there was 1,337 respondents. There was also a number of meetings held with different stakeholder groups whose comments were fed into the final report. The main responses from the consultation related to distance, time and cost that would be needed to travel to use the other venue, and any inconvenience and disruption that may cause to people. Access to the space and affordable prices at Moorways. Comments about the reduction in the number of facilities and pools in the city and the future and impacts on the building and the city centre. The feedback from the majority of respondents is that Queen should not close from their perspective. However, there was recognition that the facility in its current format would need to change. We are confident that in terms of the issues raised, these can be effectively mitigated. In terms of the staff at Queen's, 2P does not apply to the staff at Queen's, as the two facilities are not linked. However, as part of the negotiation stage of the tender process, the Council has discussed the Queen's proposal with the potential bidders. As part of those negotiations, bidders have been asked to consider the transfer of staff from Queen's to Moorways as if 2P applied, should a decision be to cease the leisure operation. All bidders recognise the skills, the knowledge and experience that the Queen's team have, and have confirmed that they would accept the transfer of staff, as this would help with their recruitment process and mobilisation to open Moorways. Moorways is due to open in spring 22 as planned. The new £42 million leisure facility provides extensive swimming, health and fitness offer for the residents of Derby, including a new 50-metre pool, teaching pool and water park, as well as a large health and fitness facility, spa studios, soft play and cafe. When proposals for Moorways were approved in 2017, there was an expectation that the services at Queen's would cease when the facility opened. This was due to the significant benefits that the new facility would bring to the city, and it being able to meet the demands and deliver the strategic outcomes for the city. I'd also just like to let Chair and yourselves know, we are aware that a petition has been received by Democratic Services, and this will be processed in line with the Council's published petitions scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. I understand that there were 1,600 people who signed a petition, which was handed in on Friday. And following this 12-week public consultation exercise, 83.1% of the public disagreed with the closure of Queen's Leisure. 94% were either against or had major concerns. Only 4% were in favour of these proposals. If consultation is meant to mean anything, it's not meant to take those views and then just say, well, we've heard what you said, but we're still going to close it anyway. I don't believe that's what should happen in democracy. I think those objections by large numbers of the public need to be heard. Let's just look at some of the comments. They're scattered throughout the document. The lack of a pool of any kind in the town centre impacts on footfall into the town. There's so much moving out was the regret. Moorways is very difficult to access without a car, and only one swimming pool in the city is insufficient provision. How do you propose for people who can't drive, either by choice or on medical grounds, will be able to get to a swimming pool, as Moorways is out of town? Additional traffic around Moorways is not convenient for users of public transport. And so it goes on. Again and again and again throughout this report, those objections quite clearly laid out. Not emotional, but practical, affecting many thousands of people, whether you live in Spondon, Chaddesden, Darley, Allestree, Mackworth. It would now entail taking more than one bus service to get there. And as some people have said, they simply haven't got the time or the resources to do that on a regular basis. And you may wish that the bus companies will say, yeah, we'll pay for it. They won't. We all know that. I think that's just a red herring. And also this red herring, well, we'll have a look again in 3 years' time, and we'll see if there's real need. That's just kicking into the long grass. No, it's just not acceptable. A city of this size does need a pool, a centrally located pool for all those people that actually need it, if the case is proved that Queen's has to close. And I think that's absolutely imperative. And I'll be making a recommendation once I've listened to contributions later this evening. Hardiel, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I totally agree with everything you've said, and I would be ready to second a recommendation to go to a council cabinet. We've already talked about in the previous indoor facility strategy about how difficult it will be of getting transport providers to do what the report says in 4.11, the discussions to actually increase public transport to the new, really state-of-the-art Moorways Sports Village, and that's great. But it's not going to be great, as you said and as Councillor Cooper said, about the people who are in the north of the city. You mentioned Spondon, Derwent is one you didn't mention, the people of Derwent, and all the northern parts of the city. They cannot wait 3 years for council officers, one, to start having negotiation discussions, which will be, in my opinion, fruitless, and secondly, the residents who are failing in those needs being met, their needs will stop being met as soon as Queen's Leisure Centre closes, not in 3 years' time, when we look at how the impact has been positive or negative to people living in the north of the city. And the consultation is quite clear. People want a facility more centrally located for the north of the city. That's not to undermine the great work and the facility that we're going to have in Moorways. We welcome that and I champion that. It's really great. It's wonderful. But it will not help the people, and equality, we talk about levelling up in the national context. We don't want to level down in our own city for the north of the people. Now, some people will have the resources to have their own transport facilities and cars, but not everybody, not people in Derwent, not people in parts of Spondon, and even dare I say parts of Darley as well, where there's people who are in deprived communities. So we need to shout out for those communities and those who have given a petition with 1,600 signatures and the consultation. I think this report talks about a small response to the consultation, but in my experience, nearly 1,600 people responding is quite good for this sort of issue. And as chair of the Race Equality Council, Race Equality Committee, sorry, the Race Equality Board, which I can't keep up with the names that have changed of that particular board, the Race Equality Board, they were also very clear that shutting down Queen's Leisure Centre in the way that this report describes, because we have a really great facility in more ways, is not something that they supported. And I'm sure the other equality boards did say the same. We must, if it's a consultation, or if we're, this has been a point in question, consultations mean responding. If you don't want consultation, say that you want to hear people's views and then you will decide what you're going to do. But a consultation means taking on board what it says. 84%, nearly 84% say no. We cannot lose a facility in the city centre or centrally located for the north of the county. We must do what we can, and I hope that we can change the thought at the moment, which is reflected in this report, and the Cabinet to reconsider not just shutting down Queen's Leisure Centre, but providing something for the people in the north of the city.
Thank you, Chair. I remember almost 30 years ago when this council house, it was the front page of the Telegraph, was stormed by hundreds of protesters when the Conservatives tried to sell off Queen Street last. That led to a major investment in Queen's and the Queen coming to Derby and opening that facility. I just say that as a matter of interest and relevance. Alison, and then I've got, I think it was Lucy, and then I've got, let me just quickly go through, yeah, I've got all your names down. Alison, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, there are more ex-Cabinet members for Leisure and Culture in this committee than we probably want to acknowledge. It's just worth stepping back in time very slightly to look at how we got to where we are. There was a decision needed to be made when I was the Cabinet Member for Leisure and Culture in 14-15 about where to locate the proposed new pool then, bearing in mind that this was not seen as the end of the line, the new pool at that point, because there was still this idea that ultimately the leisure strategy agreed by all parties in 2010, which set out a very rational understanding of the distribution of pools across the city, would still largely be adhered to. But it was recognised that both Moorways and Queen's were needed significant investment, and a decision had to be made about where to start the work with building a new pool. And myself and the Labour cabinet at the time chose the Moorways site, and that was partly because it wasn't because that was going to be big enough to incorporate a pool to cover all the city's needs. It was because people will remember at the time the arena had just opened, and so there was plans to close the sports hall at Moorways, and obviously Moorways swimming pool itself needed renewing, and there was a desire which we put in place, Labour did, for something more than just a swimming pool, but the leisure pool in it as well, and that was all part of what became Labour's plan. So at no point in that thinking process then was this idea that we would lose a city centre pool, and also a strategy that would provide swimming facilities relatively close to people right across the city. But certainly the reason that Queen's wasn't chosen wasn't because there'd be this idea that you get Moorways and then you could close Queen's anyway. It was just that there was the Moorways Sports Hall was going to close, and there is more space there to do these extra things in that pool. So my point is that closing Queen's with no plans for an extra city centre pool is really diverting from what has long been acknowledged as to be the city's needs, long been acknowledged to be the city's plans. And I think we know that there are structural problems at Queen's, and it has sucked out a lot of money from the council before. But I think, so there are issues about whether that place could be sustained. But the idea that you just close that and then don't replace it with something else, I think that is what's really troubling people, and it's actually what the people of Derby want. They want a central facility which would, as has been said, would really help our city centre generally thrive as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucy, and then Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. 2 points. One is to remind ourselves that although 4.1 says that Queen Street is the only current pool, we actually do have Gayton and Lonsdale. Lonsdale obviously about to close. This is where the hub and spoke view about swimming facilities within the city comes from. We will have a new wonderful hub, and we will have one spoke. And we need more than that. And yes, there is the potential to have private facilities, but we need to, if we're doing that, we need to negotiate in some way to make them much more available to the general public. And I very much feel that we ought to have something in the city centre. I don't think it needs to be an all singing, all dancing pool, but it needs to be something where people can go for swimming exercise without the challenge of multiple bus journeys, both from the point of view of cost and logistics. But one of the other consultation responses that's reported. And by the way, I think 1,500 responses is a really good response to a council consultation. And I think that paragraph 414 is a bit disingenuous when it says that despite this, there were only 1,537 responses. If we got 1,537 responses from members of the public about the local plan, I would be amazed. The local plan is actually a more important document than this in the whole of the city's future life. But one of those other elements is actually to do with how what is going to happen to the building, which people respect as being nearly 100 years old. It has some interesting architectural features to it. And we know that one of the elements within climate change is that we shouldn't be demolishing and rebuilding buildings without thinking about how they could be reused and repurposed in some ways. This isn't mentioned, as far as I can see, anywhere within this document. It seems to be something which the members of the public have highlighted, and it's reflected in this report. And I think there needs to be a recommendation there, Chair, to say that actually the council would like to listen to what people would like that building to be reused for. It may not be practical, it may not be something that we have the resources to do, but it may provide ideas for other potential, maybe private sector investors to look into, as I understand has happened for Pear Tree Library, which has now been brought back into use at a much lower cost than our estimates for its reuse had been. So I have a recommendation, Chair, that I can either mention now or I can pick up.
To be helpful, Lucy, if we could have contributions, so I've got a recommendation to make, and then depending on what I'm saying in mine, you might want to either add to that or put your second about the use of the buildings. That's
My
okay?
chair is about the reuse of the building.
Yeah, if you just be patient, and then we'll take the contribution, and then we'll do it. That's all right. Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Queen Street Baths, as I call it, Queen Street Leisure Centre, Queen's Leisure Centre, whichever way you want to call it, I've got really fond memories of learning to swim there. I remember going there and being nice and warm in the child's pool, and then when I graduated into the main pool, I can remember being freezing and not wanting to go in. But yeah, I've got some really fond memories of the pool. But as we've heard today from the officers, we've heard from Councillor Martin's contribution about the state of the building, the age of the building, where we are now. So, where we are now, Chair, someone recently wrote on Twitter, Queen's isn't viable to keep open as it's broken, can't be fixed, and leaks money as well as water. Chair, do you know who said that? The Deputy Leader of the Labour Group, Councillor Petefield, 11th October 2021. That's where she believes we are now. I'm not an engineer. I don't have the qualifications to go around, and I'm not qualified to say whether Councillor Petefield's right or wrong. From what the officers have said, they agree with Councillor Petefield. But I also think we need to look where we've been. Councillor Martin told us about what she did when she was the Cabinet Member for Leisure and Culture. I think Wayne brought up earlier the officer discussing previous decisions around Queen Street Leisure Centre. I'd like to draw the Executive Committee to attention to an agenda item in the 8th of November 2017 Cabinet meeting. Those present, Councillor Ranjit Banwaite, Councillors Afzal, Bolton, Raju, Rawson, Repton, Russell and Shankar. I recall, Councillor Repton, that you were an enthusiastic and loyal member of that Cabinet in 2017. At point 82 of Appendix 1, it states, this will allow the future of Queen's to be reviewed as planned, and the current expectation is that it will close when the new facility opens, i.e. Moorways. Councillor Repton, I don't think you like history lessons, do you? Especially ones laid out so plainly.
I love it, Councillor Cooper. I love your theatrics, and I'll come back to you on every single point. I can assure you of that.
Well, why don't you stay quiet, Chair, and let me have my say? Don't want to, because you were talking about democracy earlier. Let's let other people have their say, Councillor Repton, instead of cutting them off, shutting them down, and treating them poorly. Councillor Evans, we discussed this previously. I know your group supported Councillor Repton being in that chair. He was a loyalist of the Ranjit Banwait regime, and I hope you consider that in what's going to happen later. Councillor Repton. Councillor Repton, would you like to have that recorded, what you're saying?
If you can stick talking about the recommendation contained in the report, you're swaying all over the place about ancient history, councillors are no longer here, documents that are not substantiated. So stick to the point, please, and continue to talk to the report and your views on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Epps. I wanted to make sure you had your say on record. Thank you very much. I duly gave way. Councillor Epps, you were an enthusiastic member of that cabinet at that time. You were there. You voted on agenda item 10 in November 2017. My question, Chair, around this article is, I understand where Councillor Kerr is coming from. I'd like to know, has there been any considerations for the use of the Queen's Leisure Centre site when that may be due to be let other councillors know outside of the Cabinet, and where you are at that process right now? Cheers.
Before I bring the officer in, you made a couple of references there, and so I think it's right and proper that I respond to them. Of course, at various meetings, we take on board the advice that we're actually given. But sometimes it's important as elected members, you also have to challenge that advice in the light of evidence. Because we know in recent years, whether it be regard to the Pear Tree Library, the A52, the roof on the Queen's Leisure Centre, sometimes the finances are questionable about the advice that's actually given, and they don't always turn out to be the case. That's human error. We have to accept that. So I think it's worth sometimes you have to revisit those and say, let's have a look at those figures, whether that's on the A52, on the cost of the repair of the Queen's Leisure roof, or Pear Tree Library, because sometimes we don't always have the information we actually need. With regard to Queen's, I think you've been listening to the debate, Councillor Cooper, you'll have heard. The concerns are that there'll be no pool in the city centre. The difference between your group and mine, you spent 42 million, all bells and whistles, on moorways by increasing by 10 million. We had 10 million pounds, at least, plus all the money that you wasted elsewhere, where we intended to build a centrally located pool with. That was always our plans years ago, always our plans now, and that's the difference, and that's what people actually want. They want a centrally located pool. If this goes ahead, you will leave them denied of that pool. That is the difference. If you'd like to come in now, please, Wayne. Or Rachel, thank you.
The question asked by councillors about the future use of the site, I think the report states as part of the city centre plan for what we want to do around reinventing our city, obviously post-COVID and in our generation ambition. This site sits in an important part of our city. It's the northern gateway to the city, and clearly we have ownership of the site and also sites close to it in the King's Chambers. The council is therefore looking in that context, how could that be remodelled, reshaped, re-supported to create something that really is exciting about improving our city centre as a whole. So very indicative of clearly the decision's been taken at this stage, but nothing has been ruled out, nothing has been ruled in.
Right.
Thank you. Chair, I also have a recommendation to be considered. I also have a recommendation to be considered after yours.
As I indicated, I'm putting a recommendation. I said at the beginning that I wanted to make a recommendation, and I will now go through the recommendation that I will put to executive scrutiny. That Cabinet now commits to provide a replacement centrally located pool if further re-examination of the finances clearly demonstrates it is not economically viable to repair and reopen the existing facility. Such commitment and re-examination to take place before the proposed closure. So that's what I'm actually recommending. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you. Got a seconder for that. Unless anyone wants to contribute, I'll take it to the vote. Those in favour of that recommendation, please show. Those against, please show. That's the motion passed. That's the one. Just scribble this out for you. Thank you. Right. Do you have you said you have a recommendation with regard to the use of the building?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Chair, I do. Mine reads to recommend Cabinet to publicise alongside announcing the decision to close Queen's Leisure Centre that the Council would welcome suggestions for possible future use of the Queen's Leisure Centre buildings as refurbishment of property reflects the concern of consultation respondents about the site and because renewal and reuse can mean a much lower carbon footprint than the demolition and construction of a similar sized building.
Can you possibly write that out for...
I will send it to Dom.
If you send it to it?
Yes.
Did you want to come back?
I think it's a sensible point. I mean, we need to sort of give a strong steer, and recommendation to Cabinet that we do need to look at proper scrutiny about how we can actually use that facility for the benefit of our community. So I will be happy to second that.
Chair, just add that we've been talking for the last 18 months about how much we ought to be working more closely with the people of Derby. It came out because of COVID. And here's an example about where we should be working with the people of Derby and not just thinking it's up to the council itself to come up with the future uses. Let's see what all the brains out there can put forward.
If you can busy yourself scribbling that down. Yeah, of course. Those in favour of... Sorry, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Certainly. It is rather long. It's very badly worded. Recommend Cabinet to publicise, alongside announcing the decision to close Queen's Leisure Centre, that the Council would welcome suggestions for possible future use of Queen's Leisure Centre buildings as reuse/refurbishment of property reflects the concern of consultation respondents about the site and because renewal and reuse can mean a much lower carbon footprint than the demolition and construction of a similar sized building.
Do you want to do a précis of that recommendation for Chair? Councillor Cooper, do you want to...
If affordable, could you add to the end of that, Lucy?
There is no commitment here to do anything more than listen. It's not saying it will happen. It's just saying, let's have your ideas.
But in principle, could we just add on there, if affordable, just in principle?
If it's not affordable, it will never happen. If it's not affordable, it's not committing the council to do anything, except listen. Not unless you can fund it.
We'll go through the chair, please. If you can start to scribble it down, please.
Could I suggest we vote on Councillor Kerr's recommendation, and if that falls, we'll take a vote on Councillor Cooper's recommendation.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Those in favour of Councillor Kerr's recommendation, please show. Those against? Okay.
Sorry, are we wanting the if affordable to relate to the affordability of asking people,
I think we have a bit of a problem.
or the affordability of doing the thing that is being suggested?
Lucy, we've just voted on it. It looks as though it... can I have those numbers again, please? That failed.
Sorry. Now we're going to vote on the same recommendation with if affordable included on the end. Okay.
Chair, no, I want to know whether you're wanting the if affordable to relate to the cost of the consultation or the affordability to
one at a time, please.
To implementing the proposal, a suggestion.
Sadly, Lucy, that motion in that form did fail. But if anybody wants to make another revised, I'm quite happy. Councillor Dinser.
Yeah, I mean, I think the motion as it was, I thought the intention was that if it's affordable, but if that will help, it just enhances and strengthens that motion. So I'm happy to sort of consider that. Happy to second it.
Lucy, are you prepared to amend that?
But I'm very happy to amend it with if affordable. But I want to know if the affordability relates to the request for the ideas or for the implementation of the idea.
I think they mean implementation. Yeah, everybody's nodding. We're talking about the implementation, Lucy. Yeah. Not the ideas. You can't put a cost on ideas.
Is there anything else you want to talk about while I decide where to...
No. Okay. Can we? We've got the gist of this. So we can move on to the next item while this. Can we vote? Sorry.
So can we take a vote on that?
Take that vote on that. It's about if affordable. Okay.
So, do you want to recommend to Cabinet to publicise, alongside announcing the decision to close Queen Street Leisure, that the Council would welcome suggestions for possible future uses of Queen Street Leisure buildings, if affordable, as reuse and refurbishment of property reflects the concern of the consultation respondents about the site, and because renewal and reuse can mean a much lower carbon footprint than the demolition and construction of similar sized buildings?
Okay, yeah.
No, but that then would... that doesn't make sense, because that would...
Chair, it's not really for the endless debate. We have a recommendation with if affordable at the end, and I suggest we go with that, Chair, because we don't need endless debate on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, Lucy. I think it'll only get support if we put affordable at the end.
But that...
Sorry, Chair, can I suggest that we take a vote on the recommendation with it, if affordable, at the end?
Yes.
And then go with that, please.
Yeah, but please, we'll decide on that. It's member-led. All right. Okay, right. No, I'm going to rule that there will only be agreement, Lucy, if it's at the end. So I'm going to put that recommendation will be with affordable at the end. Those in favour, please show. Those against? Okay. So that's been voted on, Lucy. So if you can word it with affordable at the end. Thank you. Okay. While Lucy's... thank you very much for that, Wayne. Thank you, Claire. You're more than welcome to stay with us. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Councillor Cooper, recommendation.
Yeah, Exec Scrutiny Board recognises the short-sighted way decisions were made by the former Labour administration between 2016 and 2017. Exec Scrutiny would like Cabinet to consider whether decisions made by the previous Labour Cabinet around the Queen Street Leisure Centre were value for money.
I'm going to take some ruling on this because this isn't, I don't think, relevant looking at previous decisions being made some 4 years ago. Sorry?
Can you adjourn and then I'll contact Alex and discuss that?
No, we won't adjourn because I'm going to... I believe that's out of order in terms of we're talking about... You want to make a recommendation about decisions that were made by councillors and no longer councillors. I don't think that is relevant to this meeting. And what I'll do, I'll take a show of hands from members of executive scrutiny. Do you think that we ought to take that recommendation about something that was decided many years ago by councillors and no longer here?
This agenda item is on the future of Queen Street Leisure Centre. Those decisions back then impacted on the future of Queen Street Leisure Centre. So how is it not relevant? We're debating the future of Queen Street Leisure.
Those decisions were not about leaving the city centre without a replacement pool.
I'm fairly sure it says on the Cabinet papers that's exactly what
I'm going to take the officer now. I'll come back to you, possibly. Simon.
As the corporate director for resources, the Democratic Services Officer has asked for an adjournment just so he can have a look at the Constitution and also seek some advice. I think we should respect Dominic's desire to do that in order then we can determine this particular issue. I know Dominic has presented that to you, Chair, and I support that Dominic would probably want 5 minutes just to clarify that.
I will agree to a 5-minute adjournment. We'll meet here at 6:38. Thank you. Right. We've spoken to the constitutional officer. There's nothing necessarily to stop discussion of this, but it is up to the chair to make a decision. Now, in terms of being open to democracy, no, you can smile. I'm not going to block it in actual fact. I mean, I could do, but I'm not. So I'm going to allow you to put your recommendation to this committee, and then it's up to members to vote on it. So, Councillor Cooper, put your recommendation, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much to the officers during the deliberation to have that conversation and that space to do so. So my recommendation is Executive Scrutiny Board recognises the short-sighted way decisions were made by the former Labour administration around the Queen's Leisure Centre between 2016 and 2017. Exec Scrutiny would like Cabinet to consider whether the decisions made around the Queen Street Leisure Centre by the Labour Cabinet between 2016 and 2017 were value for money.
So, thank you, Chair. And of course, cornerstone of the Council's budgetary and policy framework is to have both a council plan and a medium-term financial plan aligned, because obviously what needs to happen is the city needs to set its priorities, and then we need to make sure that the resources are aligned for their delivery. Members will recall that a council plan was agreed at the end of the last decade, and was then superseded or supplemented by the Council Recovery Plan that we considered 12 to 16 months ago. It is felt that now is the time, both in terms of shaping the future of the city and also in terms of the evolving partnership approach and the context that we have emerged out of COVID, with that we need to bring forward a new refreshed council plan, and it suggested that the council plan vision is being ambitious for Derby, working with the city, for the city. So this is very much a city plan of where the council contributes, where the council works in partnership with others, with residents, with communities and with businesses to deliver the outcomes and shared outcomes for the city. So working with the partnership board, and there's a proposal that we centre our council plan around 4 themes: Green Derby, Vibrant Derby, Growth Derby, Resilient Derby. You can see the description and the outcome in paragraph 4.1, supplemented by a enabling council programme of transformation and improvement called Working Smarter. So the intention is that the council plan will be issued alongside the budget for consultation, which is currently scheduled for a cabinet meeting on the 21st of December, and we will seek reviews of the respondents around these priorities, partnership themes and priorities. This also allows us to rethink how we align our budget and match for resources and prioritise for resources into those priorities. So the report therefore talks about the medium-term financial strategy. I think just to give the context that the government has an ideal date of issuing its financial settlements around the 6th or 7th of December. The government has highlighted that they expect the financial settlement to come just before recess of Parliament, which is the 16th of December. So this is a strategic context setting in the absence of a local government finance settlement, which will obviously inform not only our level of funding for 1 or maybe potentially up to 3 years, but also will then allow us to present the budget proposals against a given and known settlement from the government. This report talks about our intention to prioritise it against the themes I just highlighted, but it also gives a bit of a context of where we think the local government finance settlement might be following the comprehensive spending review at the end of October. The comprehensive spending review talked about 1.6 billion for government, for local government as a whole, and we have taken an approximation that that could be an increase in our core spending power in government grants of just over £8 million. However, until we get the settlement, we will not know the distributional mechanism the government is going to use, so that is, as with any medium-term financial plan, a best estimate. What we are therefore saying is that back in February, the Council forecast a budget gap of 11.164 million. Since then, macroeconomic conditions, whether it be inflation or the supply chain, plus new responsibilities that we'll have for next year, such as the health and social care NI levy, increases in national living wage, as well as demand pressures which we are experiencing as a result of some of the demand coming out of COVID and the demand for our services, both statutory and non-statutory, that we think costs will go up and therefore will be experiencing pressures, and that's detailed in summary in this report. In order to therefore look at a budget both next year and over 3 years, we have had to look at the opportunity for savings, efficiency and income generation. And again, the report gives a headline figure in there about the level of reserves, the level of savings that we think that we will come forward in the budget consultation paper at the end of December. All of this is still work in progress, and I think this is about giving a context tonight, and then it will be refined and detailed in the budget consultation report. Based on those assumptions, and I have to say they are budget assumptions at the moment, we think there'll be a residual budget gap of around £4 million that would have to be funded from reserves in the first instance. If the settlement is more generous, then that obviously wouldn't require a drawdown on reserves of that level. The report also details the need for financial sustainability in the medium term. I think the pandemic has shown that local authorities have to plan for resilience and sustainability, and our previous parameter of at least 3% general fund balance obviously has been under stress as a result of that. So there is a reserve strategy attached here, clearly setting out the intent to increase general fund balances to a 5% level over a period of the medium-term financial plan. And you can see in the table in paragraph 4.12, there is a stated intention to contribute to reserves over those 2 years in order to promote financial sustainability, which obviously, as the Council's Treasurer, I'd be recommending that a higher level of reserves supports that financial sustainability and resilience. So the recommendations, Chair, are detailed in the report. As I said, it's really setting the scene for the detailed documents to be issued at the Cabinet at the end of December. So it's to approve the adoption of a partnership theme for the Council plan for the next 3 years, to note the strategic financial context in the absence of the local government finance settlement for that period, and that will be refined at the end of the month, and to approve a revised reserve strategy attached to Appendix A to support financial sustainability. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've got Alison, then Hardill. Alison, then Hardill.
Thank you, Chair. Just a detail, well, that's a detail and also a broader point. First, Simon, if I may. In point 4.3, so I'm looking for some explanation here, because I suggest that you've somewhat overconflated a few concepts here and tried to do without relative pronouns a bit too much when you talk about cross-cutting priority outcomes. I mean, if you take away the qualifier priority, you've got cross-cutting outcomes, which I suggest doesn't have, doesn't automatically mean much in, as a standard collocation, what is a cross-cutting outcome? I mean, I think I'm imagining what you mean is that programmes will be delivered in according to outcomes which we have prioritised, and the delivery of which will cut across services as they're currently delivered. I mean, I'm asking, first of all, is that the case? Because the phrase cross-cutting priority outcomes, I don't think means much. And then I think then what that actually suggests in terms of what the next sentence gives us is quite radical, I think, in terms of the way the council currently operates. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just think that's a big thing. If we're no longer having, say, a director of, well, we would have a director of leisure and culture for a diverse cultural offer. But are we planning a complete reorganisation of the council with strategic directors over these outcomes, or is it just will it look like that externally and in terms of the way the cabinet's formed, or is this something that you're just thinking of something more in terms of intra-officer connectivity on these outcomes? Thank you.
Right. Okay, Simon. So, what is a cross-cutting priority outcome? And what are these radical plans, revolutionary plans you've got for the council? Thank you.
Firstly, this council plan is based around that ambition for the city, ambitious for the city, working with the city, for the city. So what hopefully this report clearly sets out, that we want these to be shared outcomes with communities, with residents, with businesses, with partners. Because what we have to recognise for the City of Derby, there are a series of responsibilities, partners, businesses who all contribute to improving outcomes, whether that be our shared goal of the climate emergency and the move to net zero, whether that be tackling health inequalities, whether it be dealing with sort of a mobility and obesity, and other things here, a diverse culture offer. And it's not saying that the council needs to realign itself structurally into this, but it's saying that we all contribute, ourselves and the council and in partners, for this. So we need to get our colleagues, all 3,200, thinking about how we can deliver the best outcomes for a city. Whereas traditionally, we've got the situation where people view budgets and we spend over 250 million in a very siloed, directorate, functional space. Whereas we have to recognise that for all successful outcomes in the city, it's teams working across the piece to try and deliver that. And this is a start on that journey against a clear platform of partnership themes. And we want to transition how we believe in working together in order to achieve that better set of outcomes for the city, with the city, which is what the ambition says. So nothing radical, but actually in terms of outcomes for a city, actually quite radical in focusing on the city need, not on our functional silo approach.
Thank you very much, Simon. Hardiel.
Thank you, Chair. Just developing what Simon just said, and in response to Councillor Alice Martin's question, I mean, 4.4 is also making a new focus for the new plan, which I don't actually disagree with. Although, the idea of a council will consult on a new vision for the council, which is ambitious for Derby, working with the city and for the city. I mean, that's always been the ambition of the city council and politicians from all sides. We can never do things on our own. We can only do them in partnership with other key stakeholders and agencies within the city. So I don't rail against that, and that's something, if this will give it new vigour, that's all well and good. Then it talks about the principles of better together, which again, There's nothing I can disagree with on that, and we want to work together. And Simon mentioned the silos. We unfortunately continue to have silos within our own departments, and the more we can do to break them and get cross-cutting working, the better. And I do know that part of the better together working, and I know, Rachel, you've been leading on this, is about joining up those, reducing those silos within the department. One of the things I think we need to probably reconsider is the question of how that can be delivered when our neighbourhood teams and officers are being moved out of the City Council's central coordination role and sort of working within that and other departments within that into Derby Homes. And I know it's probably for the best intentions, but is it the best message we're giving to our officers in the neighbourhood teams? Because neighbourhoods are central to the City Council. And I know Derby Homes does a lot of good work in their localities, within their facilities, but they're not in every neighbourhood. They're not in every part of the city. So I do question, and I'm not sure whether Rachel or Simon would want to comment on that. Is that giving the right message for our staff? And do we need to reconsider that?
So it's a question about better together in 4.4.
Yeah.
Rachel, are you going to answer this
that.
one?
Yeah, I think I would make one point about the issue at Derby Homes, and clearly we have an arm's length housing organisation for financial benefit, but they really are part of the council, and clearly already we work with them to deliver services on behalf of the council. So the Derby Homes runs our homeless and rough sleeping pathway and all of our approach to homelessness, again for the city and for the council, not for Derby Homes. So I think that's quite an important distinction to make. The work that they're doing, is not just we're doing it with the council, so it's very much a joint combined piece of work better together to enhance our neighbourhood capacity by merging our existing teams to make them much more holistic, aligned, but also to think about how we bring other officers outside of housing officers and neighbourhood officers into the spaces in locality to really share information, as Councillor Dinser has said, to break down those silos, problem solve together, increase our capacity overall. So clearly, I lead Better Together work. I work for the City Council. There's no distinction in my mind between Derby Homes and the City Council looking after that function. We're doing it collectively on behalf of the city. So any reassurance I can give that really, really strongly to Councillor Dinser. But it is a really important component. And going back to the overall tone of this report, how we work collaboratively in public service is the biggest challenge we face. And I think every public service, every council, every organisation in public service recognises, after the pandemic, it's been highlighted more and more acutely that we have to work across boundaries, organisational boundaries, internal professional boundaries, functions, if we're going to be able to challenge the immense challenges that we face, whether that's about societal pressure, isolation, loneliness, climate change, a changing economy, changes in the high street, all of those things. We need to work collaboratively, and this is really what we were saying in this report. This is how we really want to motor our working going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've got a question before I bring Lucy in. In February 2021, the council set a balanced budget. How can the council justify that when the budget was set with the use of 2.772 million from reserves, and by the end of Q1, the council predicted an £11 million overspend?
I'll give a factual answer to that. The budget report talked about a one-off use of reserves as part of funding a collection fund deficit, not in balancing the core budget of the council. So it did set a balanced budget. I think Rachel has highlighted the context, and you only have to read the local government press, of the increasing demand that we saw both coming out of COVID and to probably an equal extent in terms of some of the sustainability of providers who we commission services from, in terms of increased costs being experienced in supply chain, availability of labour and everything else. Councillor Repton does quite rightly highlight the quarter one position. We have since reported on quarter two, and we have also highlighted there are opportunities in this financial year to use COVID reserves, which we had put aside, and COVID placeholders to fund some of that pressure. And we have implemented 2 spending review panels to try and financially manage in a very active way the cost pressures that this council is facing. When you have a look at the direction of travel and the gap identified in this report, it is lower than many of our comparable councils, but that is not underplaying the very serious challenge facing local governments in terms of cost, sustainability and demand. And if I got to be honest, the comprehensive spending review gave money that we could not guarantee back in February, but the challenges will remain post this local government finance settlement, a very active managing of a budget. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Lucy, then Alison. Lucy.
Thank you, and I'm going to point towards paragraph 4.2. And particularly, because I really welcome this view of trying to look holistically at what the council is doing and how we can make sure that we are getting the cross-cutting outcomes that we ought to have been striving for years and haven't been. So, you know, we've talked about wanting to reduce traffic, which means encouraging people to walk and cycle, but yet the transport function is separate from the well-being, which is separate from, you know, the school transport. You know, it's schools and business and planning, and they all come together when you want to achieve these outcomes for a healthier community. And we've been working in silos for too long, and trying to break down those silos and get those cross-cutting projects and themes and communications sounds absolutely great. But I'm just a bit concerned that not only am I going to be confused as to who I go to when I want to ask about what's happening, but the public is going to be confused about who to go to. And we're going to have to do a serious job of communication as to how to find out what is going on and making sure that it's clear who you're trying to get in touch with for particular issues. So I'm going to put that to one side and leave that with you as a challenge to be thought about. And just pick up the point at the end of 4.2, which is stakeholders. And stakeholders often seems to relate to significant other corporate type partners. It tends to be the university, major businesses, the bids, Derby College, the entities that we've set up to consult on. Marketing Derby, you know, those, the great and the good are stakeholders. But actually, our stakeholders are the people of Derby who are paying the council tax, the people who are coming in here to work, the people who are travelling on our bus services, the people who are using our roads. And I want to know how we're going to actually ensure that we are consulting with those people so that maybe we can get 1,500 people responding to this consultation, which is actually more important than the consultation on Queen's. How are we going to possibly achieve that? How are we going to communicate? It's a challenge. It would be lovely if we could do it, because that is the first step to really serving the people of Derby. And it's tied up with the council plan, which is really difficult to talk about because you've seen it, we haven't seen it, we don't know what's there. But before it becomes public, can we go through it and make sure that we really are embedding in that, communicating with the people of Derby and not just the stakeholder entities of Derby?
Thank you, Lucy. Simon.
Thank you. And Councillor Kerr makes some really important points. Firstly, the council will still be structured so you know who to approach, and the council portal will also help us to marshal those queries in. So not only do we respond, but we also learn and align ourselves better in making sure that the councillor issues are addressed across the council, as opposed to at the moment where it could go to one section, but it's not tackling the causal issue or the real issue which is being presented. So the councillor portal will be an important part of that. you mentioned stakeholders, and yes, you're quite right that we have a statutory list of stakeholders that we've traditionally gone to. The business ratepayers you have to consult with, trade unions you have to consult with, and we also consult with the Young People's Council. We have a new engagement system called, I think it's Engagement Manager, which is a much more interactive, a much more intuitive consultation tool that will help us to get more insights than maybe the more traditional consultation mechanisms that we've had. I think what we have to realise is that we have built, not officers but members, relationships with many community groups which have got stronger over COVID, and we need to tap into those, whether it be Multi-Faith Council, whether it be some of our key providers, Community Action Derby, climate groups, and we need to try and tap into those as much as possible to get reviews. We will promote it through social media. We will also use our networks to try and get the best views of the city, because I'll come back to the vision is ambitious for the city, working with the council, working with the city for the city. And we can't do that sitting in sort of a Corporation Street thinking we know the view of everyone. So we are going to tap into our networks. But as I think I said, this is a journey that we're changing the focus of our planning and resourcing. We're going to change our focus of the delivery, but we also, to be successful, need to change our focus of engaging with stakeholders so they are shared outcomes, not council outcomes. So the tools will help, but it's a journey and we will improve year on year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Alison.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Simon. 4.8 makes the point, which we are aware, that the Council has experienced some significant unplanned increases to demand and cost for its statutory services. And of course, we know that that is particularly children's services. I think at the beginning of Q2, or not too long ago anyway, the predicted overspend for children's services was still £8 to £9 million by the end of the year. And we have these panels, which 4.8 says has already assisted in a reduction in the forecast overspend at Q2. So can you tell me what that reduction is, please, in value terms? Thank you.
Simon?
There will be two aspects that those panels are helping with. One is managing demand, so managing the upward pressure of both cost from providers and also number of people requiring a service. So at the moment, our looked after children numbers, the last figure that I had was 639, which is down from what we reported at Q2, which from memory was nearly 655, 660, but I haven't got that figure in front of me. So we are, and I chair that panel, and Rachel as a strategic director chairs the spending panel. We are looking at all of the placements we got, making sure the regular reviews happen, making sure the placement is the most suitable, so people might be in a particular setting, moving into supported housing, moving from an expensive residential into foster care, and we're trying to make sure that we are as effective and efficient as possible. So the council's projected overspend as of period 8 has gone down as a result of that. In terms of children's services, what is interesting is that the cost of the children's services placements hasn't gone down proportionate to the reduction in the looked after children that we have. And that is because you only have to read in the press, the cost of social care provision is a seller's market, i.e. there's been significant cost inflation within that area. But just to give you the assurance that the panels is driving down the in-year overspend, and if it's driving that down and managing demand, that helps us to be best prepared for how to manage that demand in the future. But again, I highlight the local government press, and you will read articles of this council 40 million overspent on adult and children's social care, this council 25 million overspent. This is a national position of a broken system, and I have to give credit especially to our children and adult services colleagues who are desperately and actively managing the cost pressure here. But in the end, we have statutory duties that we have to fulfil. This is an extremely difficult balancing act. Thank you, Chair.
If I may, Chair, and with respect, Simon, I also know the work that the children's services are doing, and I respect it, and I know it's 660 down to 638 actually. I know those figures, thank you. The figure I was actually looking for is the value that's already been saved, if you like, from the overspend. So how much money, because it does say that it's already doing that. So I just wondered if you could give us a figure for that, please. Thank you.
Do you actually have the figure, Simon?
I'm happy to give that in Cabinet tomorrow night, because obviously I'd have to now look at various figures here, but for a saving in that area, we also have an increased pressure in home to school transport that I've shared.
Yeah, I know the issues with respect, Simon. I just wanted the figure, but you're saying you don't know what the figure is.
If I had 10 minutes just to make sure I gave you an accurate figure, what I've just said is that
Simon,
I'm happy to give this a Cabinet.
I can help you here. You don't need 2 minutes. It's £1 million.
Yeah, I was trying to give more context, Chair. So.
Right, okay. Okay, right. Okay, Hardiel. And then Lucy. Hardiel.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. In 4.11, Simon, you talk about the Chancellor of the Exchequer's spending review, comprehensive spending review on the 27th of October, and the headline figures, which talks about 1.6 billion more for local government spending power, and a lot of it's around the national insurance levy for health and social care, and the increase in national living wage. So all of that is adding pressures, because I think you've raised a concern here in the report, which is saying that the approval in February is disappointing at this stage, as there is no new funding identified for the ongoing impact of COVID on service demands and costs. So there's a bit of a gap between what we might get from the raise in additional 8 million to what was needed, about something like 11.4. Does that mean that our staff, in terms of any pay increases, as you say, currently being exacerbated by high levels of inflation and potential pay awards, does that mean that we may not be able to give inflation pay rises to our staff? And is that right, that we shouldn't?
Simon, can you help us on that?
This council is part of a national pay bargaining arrangement. The employers, so this is collectively the employers in that framework, have offered for the majority of staff 1.75% as the pay award for 21-22, and currently all three unions are seeking reviews of their members around that pay offer. The point I was making here is also that any pay awards for future years will have to be met within that funding envelope that we have. Members will be aware that for a number of years at the end of the last decade, there was quite a clear policy statement from governments, also embraced by local government, of a pay freeze. We are also aware at the moment that a number of the commentators are talking about pay awards having to recognise the macroeconomic or the inflationary pressures in society as a whole. So we are part of a national employers framework, and it's our plan to keep within that. Obviously, we will have to, as part of that, establish what is an affordable level of a pay award if awarded next year, and I imagine it will be awarded before you worry about that. But whether it will reflect inflation, Councillor Dinser, that is for the national pay framework to establish what is an affordable offer? Thank you.
I think it's a rhetorical statement really rather than a question. I mean, I just wonder if we value our workers more than Tesco workers, or we've just turned down a 4% pay increase. Lucy and then Alison.
I wanted to look at the bigger picture, and you mentioned the challenge that virtually every council is having at the moment in terms of its cost. There's been discussion over the years about the way in which council funding is raised, how dependent we are, as we find ourselves at the moment, on grants and additional funding out from the government, making it very difficult to be able to plan when you don't know actually what's going to be coming. Has there been any more discussion in sort of on the grapevine that you're aware of looking at ways in which local government might be funded differently? Is that a subject that is now being voiced again?
Thank you.
Simon.
Thank you, Councillor Kerr. I think all members realise that over the past 10 years, there's been a significant increase in the amount of local government funding that comes from locally generated funds, business rates and council tax. And nationally, that's in the region of 60 to 70%. For low tax-based authorities like ourselves, that means a fair proportion of properties in Band A, B, C. Obviously, we can raise less in an increase in council tax than the Surreys or whatever of this world, which will have more Band C, D, E, F properties. The government, prior to the pandemic, talked about it wanted to try and increase business rate retention from 50% to 75%, and also it wanted to carry out a fair funding review. The most recent announcement that we got is when Michael Gove went in front of the Select Committee and talked about the levelling up agenda. And part of that levelling up agenda, linked to the fair funding, is how do you distribute or not disadvantage areas in respect of their ability to raise locally generated funds. So, for example, an outer London borough has more potential to increase business rates and retain business rates than, say, a northeastern sort of a market town with low ability to increase rateable value. I think what that means is that they will use the local government funding framework as a mechanism for redistribution. And if I've got to be honest, I think Derby's in that middle of that argument, not just geographically, but also financially, and that they would then implement a period of transition. So the impact on a council moving from one position in 1 year to another is mitigated. So I'm fairly confident we'll get some guidance probably next week on maybe the direction of travel about a fair funding review, potentially for implementation in 23-24. But the pace of that change and the transition and damping, as it's called, probably means that the redistribution to those in need as opposed to those in historical local government framework and the advantage and disadvantage of the locally generated tax raising powers, I think it will be, as I've used the expression, a journey that will take quite a number of years, because they will want to avoid volatility in the local government sector. But that's the context setting. Hopefully that answers some of what you were seeking, Councillor Kerr.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Alison.
Thank you, Chair, and would hope members of the board will forgive me for asking yet another question, but I do think this is really, really important. I mean, I like Councillor Kerr, I've been aware of the context of local government funding since 2010, which has suffered from austerity measures, and local councils have not been particular beneficiaries of the recent Conservative government to overturn previous governments, Conservative governments' approach to austerity, they haven't really focused on local government. So I think it is a given that these pressures come from dramatically reduced funding from government and problems of sourcing more income locally in Derby. And other pressures, as you said, including the pandemic. However, what really worries me and what is a particular concern in Derby and was always highlighted when I was a councillor before is the reserves, which are very fragile in Derby. So 4.12 promises further contributions to the reserves, and yet what we've seen actually even before the pandemic, that this Conservative administration of the council was raiding those reserves. So how are they going to contribute to those reserves, particularly when 4.13 is planning, sort of seems to be saying that the 2023 budget won't be balanced because it will rely on reserves again. And those reserves are dangerously low because the Conservatives keep raiding them. So would you be able to tell me what was the budget risk reserve when the Conservatives took over control of the council in 2018? And what those reserves are predicted to be in March 22? Thank you.
Okay, so what were the reserves at that date, please, Simon, and what are the reserves now? Or what are the reserves going to be? Thank you.
The reserves around 2017, and this is only one of the reserves that we have as part of both the General Funds Reserve and the earmarked reserves, was in the region of, I think it was £30 million. Again, 30. Again, this is a detailed question, but I don't have the exact figure. I've got it on my computer, but it would mean distracting from here. So it would have been useful if maybe I could have been asked that previously, and I'd have come with that exact figure. When you look at the past 3 budgets, the drawdown on reserves was purely in respect of the collection fund. So the collection fund is obviously our collection of council tax and business rates, and that was the planned use of reserves. That was planned for those 3 years. We also experienced, as I think Councillor Martin has said, demand pressures, especially in children's social care, that required an outturn for 2 of those years, a drawdown on reserves to meet the demand, especially around our statutory services. And last year, there was a contribution to reserves. The report, which you'll receive at the end of the month, will detail the proposal of those level reserves for the 3 years here. And I last reported it again in Q2 of the expected level of balances in respect of the budget risk reserve. Again, I'd have to get the exact figure because I don't want to mislead the committee, but you can have a look at Q2. Just picking up the point about a responsible approach to financial sustainability is when you have a look at the shocks that both demand and COVID has placed on the local authority. I said in my opening presentation that my recommendation is increasing from what was, I think, 3.48% in February 2021 in terms of a general fund balance up to 5% to give that. And this report explicitly states an intention to build financial resilience. It doesn't mean that we will not have to manage shocks or pressures in the system that may or may not require use of reserves. But the reserve strategy is trying to be quite explicit that as part of the medium-term financial plan, we want to build up resilience by building up reserves. And the table in 4.12, that bottom line talks about all other things being equal, and I suppose I have to say that, the intention to put 8.774 million into reserves over that period. I've already explained the increased cost pressures in 22-23, inflation and demand means that, and the ability to bank and identify bankable savings for that year, is that my current professional assessment is that we'll have to draw down on reserves, in this case to the tune of about £4 million in the next financial year. Thank you, Chair.
Am I allowed to just have a comment quickly in response to that, Chair, or not?
Just very quickly, please, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, Simon. I am personally quite perturbed that given that we are, the Council is drawing on reserves so persistently and so consistently and is introducing here its medium-term financial plan, that you don't have in the back of your mind always where that 30 million is heading now. I mean, we know it's going to be a lot less, but I would have thought, you know, in any budgeting process, you're going to look at what you're left with at the end of that process. So I think we do need to know that figure, please, at some point. You know, preferably it would have been more reassuring that you had that in your mind, you know, as you were presenting this paper. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can just make it, I'll bring you back in a second, Simon, because it seems to me, I don't know if members agree with me, but central government seem to have forced councils like Derby to adopt Boris's economic policy, which is like making us play Russian roulette in the Last Chance Saloon. Our reserves have gone down because you've been forced to. I'm not blaming you, Simon. I'm certainly not blaming you. From 30 million to 8 million. This is dangerous. But this is what local authorities like Derby have been forced into up and down this country, and it is simply dangerous. And, you know, we need more questions. There's lots of questions we need to answer to be reassured, and that's why I'm going to make a recommendation shortly. But it's about the earmarked reserves. Will these be protected? And what will they be protected for? Simon?
The council has two sets of reserves. General Fund Reserve, which we have a policy to try and retain a minimum level of reserves, which allows you to meet volatility or unexpected areas, and then earmarked reserves, which are stated for a particular purpose. Our total reserves are still, from a statement of accounts, they're still of a sizable level, and it details the purpose for the earmarked reserves, whether it be a PFI reserve, which is a smoothing of unitary payments and everything else in there, to organisational change reserves and other reserves, and they're detailed. And just to pick up Councillor Martin's question, I report transparently every quarter the reserves, the balance and the commitments against it. Again, I'd say that I don't want to be flicking between committee reports here, and I can provide that literally at the rising of this meeting around what the level of the reserves are that we've got, and all members in the budget issued for consultation and executive scrutiny, which will be on the 20th of December, and also the opportunity for all members to join a budget scrutiny in mid-January, will have the chance to sort of answer that. So earmarked reserves are, again, used for the purpose that they're stated. And I've reviewed them, and we've freed up £1 million of those to go into our General Fund Reserve as part of the budget strategy. So any questions that Councillor Martin or any other councillor has over the exact figures, I am more than happy to provide at the rising of this meeting or after this meeting. Thank you.
I'm going to make a recommendation, I think, to try and move this forward in a positive, collaborative way, so we can all work together, and that's elected members of all parties with officers. And that is, executive scrutiny recommends all political groups of this council have full and easy access to information concerning every aspect of the council's finances, to enable all councillors to understand the true position and challenges we face, and to work collaboratively to find solutions to protect services and ensure value for money of our residents. Now, I've worded that in a positive, collaborative way, working with officers, working with all groups. Could I have a seconder for that, please? Thank you. Okay. All those in favour, can you please show? All those against, working collaboratively and openly? Please show. Okay, that's passed. Can I let you have that? If you can't read it, give me a ring. I've just scribbled that down. Thank you very much for that. Okay, moving on to item 13. Is this you, Simon? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Councillor Cooper.
Mic off. Because you've been leaving your mic on regularly just throughout the meeting, I've had people corresponding with me that the live feed's being cut out. So pretty much what Mr. Riley said for the last probably 20 minutes has not been heard because you keep leaving your microphone on.
Okay. My apologies and thank you for pointing that out, Councillor Cooper. My orange light is on. So, Dom, I imagine that you can hear me on the streaming. So, just before that, I talked about the role of Treasury management. I won't repeat that, but it's about balancing sort of security, liquidity and return. So this is the principles of that and doing it in an affordable, sustainable and prudent manner, which is the principles behind the Prudential Code. This report details that we've had a very, if you want to call it, stable 6 months. We've been able to invest, though not getting a high level of return, which is indicative of the economy as a whole. And secondly, it also says that our prudential indicators, i.e. the permissions that you gave me to invest and borrow, have been met. The report details 3 occasions where the level of money that we had in our Lloyd's operational account was breached, and it gives the details of that. One, for example, was receipt of a grant from a neighbouring council. Others was our joint arrangement with Derby Homes. But overall, I'm pleased to report that our Treasury management activity operated successfully over the first 6 months. And just before Councillor Cooper highlighted that you couldn't hear me, I was saying that we're looking at using our approved Treasury instruments, i.e. money markets, local authorities, debt management office, to see if we can get a better return than the 0.1% that we have detailed as the average return in this report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Any comments or questions at all? Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. And that final point, I think, the final point answers one of my questions, which was why we have such a low return on our investments when we have inflation rising, and I think you're going to explore that one. The other 2 points I had is why there's a recommendation to say that we want to put our outturn position, estimated at just under £1 million, into the Treasury Management Reserve. And I just would like to explore that a little bit more. And I've got a second question.
Simon?
The Council has operated a Treasury Management Reserve because what we do is to provide for the borrowing which is attached to the approved capital financing requirements, so the capital expenditure that we have. And we recognise that that borrowing will come at some point. We haven't had to do it for a number of years because we've negated expensive borrowing by using our investments and our internal reserve-backed cash to stop that. And what we want to try and do is to avoid, in a sense, banking that as part of the general fund and then suddenly having a peak as and when that borrowing happens. So it's a smoothing approach. And that's in line with what we have done for the past 2 to 3 years that I've been here, and I think for a number of years prior to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Lucy?
May I rephrase that and say that it's in anticipation of having some capital spend at the beginning of the new financial year?
You can explain it in 2 ways. Firstly, that because we've reported an element of capital slippage, we won't have to borrow as much, but that capital expenditure is still improved to be incurred. So it's not immediately banking that and then suddenly having a peak in the following year, just trying to smooth it over a period of our medium-term financial plan.
Thank you.
So maybe. And the other question is in 6.4, it comments, I'm sorry, my computer's shut that down again. We had been looking at a £10 million cash flow borrowing to balance day-to-day spending, which we have repaid because we're now covering that in some other manner. Can you say a bit more about that?
We took out some temporary borrowing during COVID because we did not know of the cash flows during that, including receipt of government grants, paying out of business rate grants and a whole range of other factors. And prudently, I did some temporary short borrowing in order that we had more liquidity in line with our treasury management strategy. We did not require that because the government especially came good in giving quite a lot of that money up front in front of need, and therefore we've been able to repay that, and by implication we don't have any long-term borrowing costs attached to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Moving on to finally item 14. Is this going to be you again, Simon? You're earning your money tonight, that's for sure.
I assume you finished item 13 and accepting or noting the recommendations.
Okay, yeah, it will be to note, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Item 14 is the standard compliance with contract and financial procedure rules. There's 3 on the main report and then there's an addendum report. The 3 on the main report is the DASH procurement framework. So DASH is a service to improve housing conditions in the private rented sector. And this is about creating a couple of frameworks, one being a framework for specialist training, and secondly for property inspection, which allows this service, which is recognised as really effective across both ourselves and other stakeholders in the East Midlands, but will allow us to be agile in carrying out the required actions and for that to happen. The second item on here is just giving permission due to the size of the contract that will be entered into for the financial management system replacement. The council has a system that was purchased in 2007, upgraded in 2012, and is now, if you want to call it, a bit tired in respect of its functionality because it's no longer supported by the vendor, though we have third-party support in respect of a core Oracle system. So this is to delegate to myself, in consultation with a relevant cabinet member, to award the contract of a shortlisted bidder for the financial management system replacement project. There is provision in the capital programme for this of up to £2 million. Our preferred bidder will be within that amount, and again, that will be exercised before Christmas in line with the tender process. And the final area on here on this report is in respect of the green homes and energy efficiency scheme, which is supported by the government funding. And you'll remember back in July we received a report on this. This is to highlight, I suppose, a couple of issues. Firstly, with all the changes in the supply chain and construction inflation, the average cost of a intervention has gone up from, say, 10,000 to about 14,000, and we have to recognise this. And there's also been a change in the number of private sector properties that can be supported. So what this report recommends is 180,000 will assist in bridging the unexpected inflation costs, and 4.21, the assessment of our colleagues is this still represents good value for money, and that the Green Homes Grant LAD 2 external funding still contributes 60% of the cost. So this is about helping to achieve and deliver on that objective. So happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, any comments or observations? If not, then I would like to thank everybody for attending. That's it is a question of noting the report, and
there's an addendum that was issued by the...
Do you want to take that now, and Simon?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
So this report is in respect of seeking approval to bid to Homes England for 800,000 Capital of Gardens community capacity funding. Members who have been on this scrutiny board for a while will know that we have received a series of funding previously from the government to help to try bring this forward. That totaled 461,000 previously, and we've also bid, as approved in July, for £500,000 of revenue funding. The important context that this report talks here is obviously, as part of the Levelling Up announcement, there was just shy of £50 million awarded for the junction on the A50. That was the largest Levelling Up fund in the country, and that's a key part of that junction is to help unlock the South Derby Growth Zone, which includes the Ragley Way, Sinfins, Tenson Fields, the Lowe's Farm, Chellaston, major housing development, and is one of the 14 new garden villages announced by the government on the 2nd of January 2017. So fundamentally, this is bidding in to help, hopefully, if we were to be successful, is to develop that vision of the South Derby Growth Zone and Infinity Garden Village. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Any comments or observations? If not, then I'd like to thank you all for attending this meeting this evening of Executive Scrutiny. Good evening. A safe journey back. Thank you.